everybody, welcome back to the Claremont Classic Garage. Today we're going to continue working on our 1948 Ford 8N, and today's project will be getting the front axle and the steering all back together. First thing on is going to be the front axle support, or the bolster as some people call it. Goes on with these 7/16 spine bolts and a lock washer and a nut, and the washer and nut are on the back side. We'll torque these to 60 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to put the bushing back in the axle. There's not really anything wrong with this bushing. It's not worn or anything. It just, when we took it apart from sitting, the pin was seized into the bushing and it all came out in one piece. So we're just going to put it back in. I honestly have never checked the book to see what they recommend, but when I put it in, if it's a split bushing, I put the split to the side, because the axle pin is always going to be working like this in the axle, so you want the joint to the side. We could, if we wanted to, use the pin as a mandrel to drive this thing in. That'll work just fine also. I chose to use this, and it went in really easy. Just a few swats with this hammer, and down she went. I also would like to point out that even though I said we put a lock washer on here, when I put it on, we don't. The bolts aren't long enough, so they go on, no washers. Now we're going to put the axle in, or the axle beam, the center beam of the axle. So it's going to sit in here. Our pin is going to go through, and on the back side of the bolster, this spacer. This is something new that they added for the 8N. 9Ns didn't have this. The axle on this thing, the bushing is theoretically a dry bushing, but you could put a little anti-seize or something on it if you want. I guess it wouldn't hurt anything. Don't really. Some guys have drilled them and put grease fittings in them. The old way of thinking with that is that the grease would attack dust and dirt, and it would get trapped in the grease and almost turn the grease into like a lapping compound like you would use on valves and eat away at the bushing. And I kind of think that's correct. So we stick the pin through, stick our spacer on the pin. Now, the axle beam is going to go in with the thick side to the bottom, because that's where the weight is, right? The weight of the tractor sits on the pin. Uh-oh. We got to put it through this way, because the fan is there. Anyway, doesn't matter. Any port in a storm, they say. There she goes. All right, let me grab something to smack it. It's not really all that tight of a fit. It's just the way with this axle being swept back the way it is, it makes the damn thing awkward. There we go. So you can see how it'll end up sitting there like that. And then washer goes in the back. Now they had 3 of these thin washers. This is not the washer that if you buy the parts from Ford you get. You get one washer that's about as thick as those 2. So that's what we're going to start out with. That was something they did to help try and keep the axle from twisting like this all the time, to get it a little more tighter in there. But at the same time, the way it moves through its travel like this as it's working, you do need a tiny bit of back and forth movement. So anyway, whatever, there was 3 in there to start, so we're going to put the 3 back. And the pin is held in with this 1/2-inch fine bolt. We'll just snug that up. See, our axle's got a nice fit on the pin. Now we can put on the radius rods. Unlike the 9N and the 2N that just had a nut and a bolt holding them on these 8Ns, They're held on with a clevis pin, and they are really fun to get out, let me tell you. Anyhow, you want to, before you put your pins in, you want to make sure the ends of them aren't mushroomed. I had to clean that one up. And you want to run a 9/64 drill bit through where the cotter pin goes. And the radius rod goes on with this counter bore up, and lots of anti-seize on it, and we'll just tap it down through. Sometimes you might have to lift it up like that to get the bottom hole to line up, but they'll go right in. There. We've got our radius rod in the socket and put the cap on. Sometimes you have to jiggle the axle around a little bit to get it to go in, but this one went pretty well. You leave this, as tempting as it is to put grease in there, don't do it, for the same reason we don't put grease in the axle bushing, because we don't want a bunch of grit getting in there and turning it into lapping compound. So we'll run these down and tighten them to 60 foot-pounds. Now I can put the axle knees on. So that uses these big, huge 5/8 bolts. So the first thing I do, number one, after the fun I had getting them out, lots of anti-seize all over them. And we stick one in the very end hole here. Then you grab your knee, and it's easy to tell which one you need. The round side is the front, and it'll have this flattened side on the back, and you just stick it over there, and on she goes. Another thing, make sure the grease fitting is at the back. That's another way to know you've got it on the right side. Then we'll take another bolt and put it to the fourth hole, the furthest one inboard, and knock that through. There we go. Then one of these big huge nuts goes on. And you can see there we don't really, yeah, I think we do. I can't remember if these things carry a flat washer or not. We'll put them on the first couple, and when we tighten them up, we'll find out if it needs to stay there or not. If I haven't got bolt thread sticking through the nut, we'll take them back out. I made sure that I torqued these to 120, and you can see there the bolt just sticks through the nut. So yes, it does want a flat washer in there. And the last thing we do, once we've got all that done, make sure the axle pivots, which it does, and put the cotter pins in the bottom of the radius rod pins. Now we're going to have a go at the steering box. First thing I'm going to do is stamp these housings, 1 and 2, the sector housings, so that if stuff goes sideways here, I've always got that reference of where I started. So what we're going to do is get the sector housings off. Somebody's been in this steering box before us, because there's supposed to be aluminum shims behind these little housings, and they're not there. Okay, that one came out with the sector. Now, even though that sector's missing a hunk of a gear, it still works pretty well. There's the other sector. Now we can pull out the shaft, and this has got your ball nut on it. So this thing at some point has been full of grease, which is one way to tell it's had problems. Guys like to put up grease in them. The problem is when you fill them up with grease rather than oil, it's really, really hard for the grease to get in here in the ball nut, and it wears out. First thing we've got to get in is the steering shaft and the ball nut assembly. Is what we're going to set up with now. and that's the preload on the steering shaft. So this thing floats between these two bearings. There's a bearing race down in the bottom there, and the other one is in the bottom of the tower. And what happens over the years, these things get all worn out, and the rollers will actually disintegrate and just kind of disappear. So you end up with all kinds of end play. And what people perceive as loose steering, if they'd look at it when they steer, they could actually see this thing, it goes up until it hits the bearing, and then it starts to steer. And all you really need to do is renew these bearings, and your steering box is good. Anyway, what we're going to do now is get the end play on this set up. Originally, this would have had a little retainer and a little brass push pin to hold this bearing on while you lower it in there, but it's long gone. So, but we have grease. So we're just going to smear a bunch of, it's just to hold it in for a split second till you can get the darn thing stuck down in there. So there we go. And we'll put a little more grease on it here just to make sure the bugger stays there. And then it's going to go right down in there like so. There we are. And we can feel it's in that race and it's working quite nicely. And you'll notice these bearings, they're not straight or tapered. They're actually kind of got a spherical shape to them, which allows them to have a little give. Because nothing in this world is perfectly straight, apparently. So this one, the cage is missing a couple of little fingers that hold the rollers in. So we're going to be very careful and lower this bearing into place over the shaft and make sure the rollers stay, because I just don't have a new one. So we got that bearing lowered down onto there. I only lost all the rollers out of it once, and I had to glue it back. So next what we have to do is we have to select a shim pack to go in here. So one by one, we just lower these shims on, clean them up, make sure there's no crap in between them. We'll lower them on, and then we'll put this top piece on and tighten it down and see how our end play is. Now we can put this thing on. Now what you'll see is when you put this on, this bolt boss is offset a little bit, so that goes this way to the back. And every one of these is going to be a little different. Like you can go try and tighten it right up, but this one, because a couple of these, like the bearing races are a little bit pitted up, you don't want to get it super tight. You want it just right. Like there. See that end play? That's no good. So we got to take some shim out. I took out a few shims, and it's still pretty loose. So we'll take some more out. Eventually we'll get that magic one. Okay, that seems pretty good. So now what we're going to do is put the bolts in here and zip them down and see how it feels then. All right, I've got it down to where I've got just the tiniest discernible amount of end play. And you can see there that still has that's exactly perfect. And it runs up and down there nicely. So we're good to go. Now we can put the sectors in. I just used a screwdriver to pop the seal out, and that's the original leather seal. Wow, that'll leak. So we got our new seal. Put a little grease on the lip. This is a tool that I made. And then what I do, once I've put my new seal in, I always put the old seal back in because there's room for it, and it's like kind of like a dust seal. We got lots of sealing going on there now. So now what we can do is get this baby greased up, our sector. Now what you'll find is this thing has got 3 large teeth on one side and 5, or in this case 4 3/4 small teeth on the other. So the 3 large teeth are what engage the ball nut. We're going to get this in here. You just kind of twist, get it through the seal. There we go. So what we're going to do is get the middle tooth here, which is this one, engaged in the middle tooth on the ball nut, which is that. Just like so. And then jiggle that down in there. And notch to the bottom is 0 adjustment. So that's your baseline. And we'll just stick a bolt in wherever one will fit. That one's a little long, I'd say. Let me find a shorter bolt. I don't know where all the bolts for this thing went. So this sector, the fine side, or the side with more teeth, goes middle tooth to middle groove. Just like that. And notch to the bottom for 0 adjustment. What we've done now, we've got the steering wheel on it just so we've got something to hold. And we're going to try and get this plate out of it by turning this adjuster. It's got just a slight eccentricity to it. So this just went back. That 0 adjustment position seems to be the best place for this one. It is off 2 notches from where it was when we started, but if you remember, we changed the shim pack in here a little bit. The relationship of everything is slightly different than it was before. So now what we're going to do is get the other side sorted out. Now we're going to check the relationship between the 2 sectors, and you can see here there is no play at all. That's about as tight as. Once we are happy that the adjustment is where we want it, we're going to mark it there. Now, there is an aluminum gasket that goes behind this. I don't have any, so we're going to use the next best thing, silicone. So, we're just going to pull off. We're going to leave the sector gear in and pull this thing off. None of these holes go through, so we don't have to worry about them leaking. I'm going to put a bead of silicone around here. And put this back exactly right where it was. You can see there my mark. It's right on center. That's good. There's our mark there. And line it up. Where did my little punch go? Now one of these things goes on, and I have to find some longer bolts because there's no way in heck those are long enough. I kind of wonder if it's this length we need. No, that's too long. Something in between. Last thing we're going to do is up underneath here, we're at the bottom of the steering shaft, there's a Welch plug. And sometimes they will leak from there. So we're just going to put a little silicone around where that Welch plug is. And hopefully that'll stop any possible leaks. We're happy with the way the steering box works, so we've bolted it back to the tractor. This here is your normal fill plug where you would fill it up in there with a funnel. I'll show you why I don't like filling it up from there in a second. Sometimes you'll see them with a grease fitting in there instead of the pipe plug. And that's because they've been leakers. They leak out the sector seals here. Guys get tired of that, so they pump them full of grease, which, as I described earlier, is really hard on the shaft and the ball nut. That being said, I guess if you're going to have something in there, grease is better than nothing. I'm sure some of it does work its way in there. Anyway, what I do is I take these 4 bolts out, remove this top housing, and fill it up right from there. And I'll show you why I do it that way. If you look at where the fill plug is, and you look at where that bearing is, it's kind of hard for that bearing to stay kind of submersed in oil when it's only filled up to a point below it. Now, lucky for us, where's the hole? You can see here, there's a hole there in the steering tube, and it's hollow at the top. So you can fill oil in and it'll slowly trickle into the box, but that's a hard way of doing it. We're just going to pump it right in here with a barrel pump. So we use this thing, this old barrel pump. And as you can see, we've got this pretty much filled up right to the top. Now it's filled up to the factory, the factory fill plug. You can just see it in there. And look, the bearing is not even in the oil. So I guess as you were driving around, it would slosh, it would slosh, it would slosh. But once a very, very small amount of it leaked out, that bearing's going to run dry. And that's one of the big problems with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure these shims are all sealed up, and we're going to put some more. We'll have this thing filled up to here with oil. Now we'll just shoot one more pump of that grease down here, and that should, we get her filled up to about there. It's going to be good. It's hard. I couldn't get it with the camera, but I looked down there with a flashlight, and she's filled up to about there with gear lube. So we're in good shape. Now we can close it up. So what happened? This is a little bearing that goes in the top of it. We'll push that down in. I'll put a little oil in it. And then this spring and seat goes under the steering wheel and just keeps that bearing pushed in. Now we'll get the steering arms on. They are on a tapered spline, so once you get them kind of knocked on there, they're on for keeps. You need to use a pitman arm puller to draw them off. So when everything is centered up, the straight ahead position is when they're pointing right at the top stud in the radius rod socket. You can see that's how it is on both sides. So we're just going to run it through its travel and make sure it feels okay. Which it does. So I'm going to go ahead, I'll grab a socket and blast those things on, and then we can get a coat of primer on this. Now we're going to build up our drag links. These are replacement ones. The original ones, the back drag link end would be about this long, and then it would have a short adjusting sleeve, and then the front drag link end would be screwed into that. The rear ones are right hand thread, and the front ones are left hand thread. The flats, the adjusting flats on the tube, always go to the front. So we'll screw these things in. I'll go with a tape measure and get a rough kind of idea how long it needs to be. Now we can install the drag links for keeps. You want to make sure the seals are good. That is the original leather seal on the back of that one, and it's still okay. I put a new seal on the front. We're going to make sure that the tapered holes are clean and the stems are clean. I already cleaned all that up. And we'll go ahead and put on our nut. These originally, I think, probably had a castle nut with a cotter pin. I never put castle nuts back on them. And the ones at the front on 8 ends, they use these little half nut because the clearance past the top of this yoke is really tight. In fact, on that side, you'll see that's some kind of aftermarket drag link end, and there's too much thread sticking out. I'm gonna have to go with a zip wheel and cut that off because it's gonna hit the radius rod when it swings through its arc. So we'll see what this one is like. Guys, don't eat the stool, please. Hello. Don't eat the stool, you silly dogs. I temporarily bolted the face and frame of the dash together with just a couple of little 1/4-inch bolts. I put a new rubber grommet in the top and we'll lower this down over the steering column. Oh, there we go. We've got our steering and front axle all put back together. The rough alignment is set. I went ahead and used a zip wheel and cut off the bit of stud that was sticking through here. So now they clear the yokes on the radius rods, no problem. That'll do it for this one, I guess. In the next one, we're going to tackle my favorite job, the body work. I want to do a video for you guys on the entire electrical system, start to finish. So in order to do that, I need the fenders mounted on it, so we can hook up the lights and trailer plugs and all that type of stuff. So that'll be an adventure in itself. You know how I love body work. Anyway, until we get there, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Claremont Classic Garage. So long for now.